Good morning and welcome. My name is Mike Rios-Keating, Social Justice Education Manager at Catholic Charities, Twin Cities. On behalf of our organization, thank you for taking the time to join this important conversation. At Catholic Charities, we serve and advocate for those in need in our community, including those experiencing homelessness and housing instability. We know for many of our clients, prior involvement with the criminal legal system, even if it took place long ago, can be a barrier to finding safe and affordable housing. And as a housing first agency, we believe safe and stable housing has the power to reduce recidivism and interactions with the criminal legal system in the first place. There's still much work to be done, but education and having the conversation is part of that work. So thank you to Emily, Nadine, Rich, Fong, Father Dan for offering your voices, perspectives, and personal experiences here today. And a special thanks to Turn Signal, this event's sponsor and community partner. Black-owned Minnesota-based Turn Signal is an on-demand, real-time service that provides 24/7 legal guidance from an attorney to drivers while their camera records the interaction, a benefit we are proud to offer staff at Catholic Charities. When drivers are stopped by law enforcement officers or involved in a car accident, they can access live video chat with an attorney at the press of a button or voice command. Turn Signal was born out of necessity in this same city where George Floyd tragically lost his life to police violence. Their hope for the future is to make drivers feel safe and empowered every time they get on the road. Thank you again to the Turn Signal team. Before we begin today, I want to take a moment to invite you to think about where you are. Whether you are in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, greater Minnesota, or perhaps you're tuning in from elsewhere in the US. Catholic Charities program sites are located on ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of Native nations. In our case, in the Twin Cities, Dakota people. As we continue to work toward a mission and vision rooted in human dignity, it's critical to acknowledge the nations upon whose land we live, learn, and work, especially in a conversation about housing and criminal legal system. An acknowledgement is just one of the many ways we are committed as an organization to better honoring, supporting, and advocating for Native nations who share geography with Minnesota, and to better understand our relationship to that history. There's still much work to be done, but I invite you to hold that in our conversation today on housing in place, justice, and dignity. As we begin today, I want to direct your attention to the Q&A button on your screen. Our guest, Emily, will begin with a short presentation, followed by a conversation with our four panelists, and we will end with some time for audience Q&A. At any time from now until the end, you can submit a question via the Q&A button with the option to do so anonymously. If a technical question or something urgent, someone from our team will respond in the Q&A module. Otherwise, we will hold it until the end. Some of you may have the same question, so you also have the ability to upvote a question or like a question that you would like to see asked. Lastly, the chat is disabled, but I very much believe in community wisdom. You all have something to offer this space as well, so there's the ability to comment on questions, though I ask that you remain respectful of your fellow community members. And with that, I'd like to kick off today's conversation with Emily Baxter. Emily, I met Emily a while back. I'm going to bring her forward for you. I met Emily a while back when she joined our podcast for a conversation on the work of We Are All Criminals, a photo and story-based catalyst for conversations about race, class, privilege, and punishment. Prior to this, Emily served as the Director of Advocacy and Public Policy at the Council on Crime and Justice, and as an Assistant Public Defender representing members of the Leech Lake and White Earth bands of Ojibwe. She is an attorney, advocate, and photographer working with families, community groups, and national organizations to highlight injustices and amplify the voices and stories of people most impacted by our criminal legal system. Welcome, Emily. Thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to everybody for joining in. I want to kick off today's conversation with a little bit of background information on the project that I've been working on and the organization that now exists called We Are All Criminals. Allow me to ever so elegantly share a screen. See if I can do this. Well, ah, yes, Mike, is it
Great.
awesome? Thank you. Let me collapse this so I can see. Have you ever been convicted of an offense? Yes or no? For many people on the chat in this virtual space, your answer may be no. For Anthony, a gentleman I met when working as an expungement attorney at the Council on Crime and Justice some years ago, the answer to this question, a question he was asked when applying for an apartment, a loan, school, jobs, was yes. He was not alone, not by any means. 65 to 100 million people in the United States have a criminal record. And he wasn't alone in how it affected him. That night, the night that I met him, Anthony was deeply distraught. As I looked at Anthony, I thought, how many times had I taken something that wasn't mine? Sure, I'd considered my own criminality before, but not like this. I hadn't really thought about what life would look like under the shadow of that record, under the suffocating stigma of having been caught. How many things had I stolen over the years? Illegal substances consumed, boundaries tested, rules bended, laws broken. How had my skin color and my zip code prevented me from ever being within the crosshairs of the criminal legal system? And what would life be like for me now if I didn't have the luxury to forget the things that I had done then? 1 in 4 people in the United States, 1 in 4 people in Minnesota doesn't have that luxury, right? 1 in 4 people has a criminal record. I contend that 4 in 4 have a criminal history. In other words, we have all violated the law. There's just a small portion of the population that has a public and permanent record that alleges as much. So for the past few years, I've been traveling around asking people like me, the 75% of people in the United States with criminal histories, but no record, what have you had the luxury to forget? Today, I want to share with you just some of the more than 400 stories I've collected over the years. And just a footnote, I am forever grateful to the generosity, for the generosity and the vulnerability of the participants who have shared their stories with me. The stories I'm going to share with you this morning I'll focus mostly on crimes committed before brains were fully developed. It's, of course, not the full story, not by any means, but it is when the bulk of criminal activity occurs. And when, for those who are caught or accused of even minor offenses, people can become ensnared in a system that does not let go. Some of these stories of crimes committed for which people were not caught are going to be petty. Some happened decades ago, and others a bit more recently. In doing so, I hope to offer a new and personal way of examining the true effects of our juvenile and criminal legal systems upon a person, and the disparate impacts of those systems upon Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, and people experiencing poverty across the United States. This will be a call for reason, for equity, and for mercy, and acknowledged ownership in the problem as well as the solution. This will be about how we see each other based on how we see ourselves. Now, for those of you on the call who have been directly affected by the criminal or juvenile legal system, this is simply a reminder that you are not alone. But first, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph taken from the Sentencing Project with data taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And it shows the US state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2021. Now, barring for some general population growth, you can see that the number of people we put behind bars in the United States was relatively steady until things started to shift in the 1970s, pick up speed in the 1980s. And by the 1990s, our incarceration population truly exploded. More than 4 decades ago, we began the deliberate and regrettable march toward this, the imprisonment of nearly 1.5 million people. Wars on drugs and mental illness and poverty, private prisons, 3 strikes rules, mandatory minimum sentencing, tough on crime policymakers, prison drunk prosecutors, and concentrated policing in Black, Brown, and Native communities are just a few of the many policies and practices that have led to this mass incarceration, mass disaster. Here's another stat that many on the call may be familiar with. This mass incarceration is not only unprecedented in our own history, it's unparalleled in the world. The US holds approximately 5% of the world's general population, but boasts nearly 25% of the world's incarcerated population. This land of the free has become the world's warden. For women in America, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Now, what's additionally concerning is what happens to individuals when they're no longer in the system, when they're back in the community trying to get on with life. That's when a new punishment begins. That's when people find that they may no longer be locked up, but are now locked out of housing and jobs and school and countless other opportunities to find stability, move on, and move up. But before we delve into the world of collateral consequences or those lifelong effects of a criminal record, let's take another look at this graph. As I said, it shows the US state and federal prison population, but just as importantly is what it does not show. It doesn't show the hundreds of thousands of people in county and parish jails. It doesn't show those on civil commitment, on immigration holds. It doesn't show kids in juvenile detention. It doesn't show the millions of people on probation and parole, their liberties curtailed, held under the thumb of the criminal legal system, just not spending their nights behind bars. They are not shown here on this graph. And it doesn't show, again, the estimated 65 to 100 million people like Anthony, people held underwater by their criminal records, unable to come up for air. They are not shown on this graph. And just as importantly, it doesn't show the millions of children, the countless siblings, parents, grandparents, spouses, partners, and greater family and community members who can all be profoundly affected when someone is taken out of the home and then, due to a series of collateral consequences, not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. So what may initially appear to be a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores, you realize that this is just a drop in the overall greater ocean of a crisis. That crisis, of course, is not borne equally across the United States. Again, from the Sentencing Project, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for Black males born in 2001 is 1 in 3. For white women, it's 1 in 111. Now, that's not to say that we white women aren't committing crimes, right? We are, but we are not who you see, proportionately speaking, within our criminal and juvenile legal systems. Again, note that the rates of offending do not come close to explaining these disparities. Looking at just the war on drugs, arguably one of the greatest contributing factors to our current carceral crisis, white and Black individuals use and sell drugs at roughly the same rates. Yet Black individuals are far more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned, and then perpetually punished through a web of collateral consequences than are white individuals for engaging in the same behavior. In addition, our system disparately affects individuals with mental health and substance use disorders and profoundly affects people experiencing poverty. For example, there are more than 12 million arrests made each year in the United States. 80% of those arrested qualify for public defense. In many jurisdictions across the nation, in order to be eligible for free defense, one must live in a degree of poverty I posit is virtually inconceivable to the people who pen these policies. Now, understand that disparities start early. For example, Black youth as young as 5 are suspended and their actions criminalized at far higher rates than their white classmates, again, for engaging in the same behavior. And that record, by the way, can affect their housing, their family's housing, and their future housing for years to come, because kids these days are growing up in the data age where a scarlet letter is stamped upon the ether that no amount of scrubbing can clean. This means we are foreclosing futures before brains can fully develop. Now, out of the juvenile world and back into the adult realm, according to the National Employment Law Project, 1 in 4 people in the United States has a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice statistics, that number may be closer to 1 in 3, and those waters just keep rising. Criminal records can affect nearly every aspect of life, from employment to, as we all know on this call, housing. When I was doing rights restoration work at the Council on Crime and Justice, I remember unhoused people in Minneapolis who would be on the public housing waitlist for years, only to be denied once their name finally bubbled to the top because they had a public urination charge within the last 12 months. I remember grandmas losing housing because grandsons were caught smoking pot in a nearby parking lot. Entire families out on the street because the cousin who had been crashing on the couch got into a fight at the bar across town. I remember parents coming home from prison or jail and not being allowed to live with their in subsidized housing with their spouses and children. I remember private landlords who would charge excessive background fees, knowing full well that they weren't going to rent to the individual. And then the rare one that did rent to someone with, say, a felony record, only doing so with first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit, all at an inflated rate. Criminal records can also affect access to professional licensure, public benefits, access to education, immigration, the ability to travel, the ability to cast a ballot. In happy news, in Minnesota, we have now passed Restore the Vote, allowing individuals who are on felony probation and parole to cast a ballot and to have a say in their community. You can contact me at We Are All Criminals for more information on that, and keep an eye on social media for upcoming webinars about the implementation of this exciting new law. So criminal records can affect nearly every aspect of who we are and how we engage in the world, from personal to professional, from social to psychological. We're confined and defined by our criminal records. But not everyone is defined by their past. Really, only just a few of us, just 1 in 4 of us. The rest of us have had the opportunity to skate through life unscathed by that particular reminder, public, permanent, instantly accessible reminder of our past acts. I've spent the last decade recording these recordless crimes. In 2012, I bought a camera and a recorder. I hopped in my Geo Metro. Unfortunately, she's no longer on the road. I really miss that car. And drove all across the state and now all across the United States, meeting people in bars and in cars, in diners, and quintessentially Minnesotan on boats, anywhere where somebody might feel comfortable enough to disclose to me something that they've otherwise never had to explain. Now, these range in severity from the quite serious, like this student and his aggravated robbery, to the relatively innocuous, like this woman who as a young teen shoplifted bangles and LPs to cope with the loss of her mother. Once she was able to access counseling, mental health care, and work through pro-social ways to address her grief and loss and trauma, the thieving stopped. Some people note not just the luxury to forget, but the luxury of never regretting, while others are deeply sorry. Some are not ashamed, but are shaken at the realization of what could have happened, like this medical student who said, "I'm a good mom, and I'm going to be a great doctor. I can acknowledge my criminality and my own vulnerability, and that is the root of compassion." There was this woman who sold weed to, quote, frat bros, and football players so that she could get a "hey, what's up" in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. I hear that time and again. People just engaging in criminal activity to feel like they're a part of something, right? It's a very basic human need. Time and again, I've heard from people who recognize that crime is an event in a life course, not a static characteristic of one's being. I've heard from law enforcement officers who reflect upon the weight of the mistakes that they've made. I've interviewed social workers who have tipped over porta potties with high school rivals inside, and pediatricians who blew up porta potties as teens in chemistry experiments gone awry. Porta potties and mailboxes are two very popular targets for teenage activity. Now, sociologists theorize that if someone is labeled, say, a bad kid, that child will come to identify with that perception of themselves. And it's not just the developing brain that responds this way, but people of all ages. So even if a barrier isn't in law, right, penned in the books, being constantly reminded of one difficult year or a regrettable week or 10 terrible seconds, an act of youth or boredom or intoxication or survival, can curtail endless possibilities in life, especially in this data age where one is never allowed to forget. Now, I'm not suggesting that we somehow forget the harm that's done, not by any means. We must do everything that we can, everything reasonable, rational that we can to prevent harm. I believe that means investing in people, investing in neighborhoods. My guess is, because you're on this call, you believe the same thing. Pouring money into housing and schools and healthcare and career creation, for example. I believe that means addressing root causes of violence and harm and discontinuing a reliance upon a system that perpetuates and exacerbates that harm. Now, where we cannot prevent harm from happening, and we will fail to always prevent it, then we have the opportunity and the obligation to create consequences that are reasonable, rational, equitable, consequences that hold people accountable for their actions and the harm that they've created, but they're responses that prioritize the needs of the people who have been harmed too. I believe that these consequences must then, to stay true to all of that, be merciful. They must have an end, a chance to be redeemed, a path to redemption, to move on, because without hope, what does one have? And here's the deal. All of us are going to make mistakes in life. Hopefully, the older we grow, the fewer our mistakes will be. But the worse or more difficult or less valued hand you're dealt in life, the less your margin of error. We Are All Criminals is about the human cost of those mistakes or acts of stupidity, intoxication, or again, survival. And it's about that margin of error. It's about those acts that, because of the records, can snowball, further marginalizing people, locking them out of life. This is about the human cost of not allowing people to move on, the human cost of never allowing people to come up for air. Make no mistake, this project is most definitely a commentary on the disparate impact of our nation's policies, policing, and prosecution. Many, not all, but many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a race and class that is not overrepresented in our criminal legal system. And some of the participants have been pretty straight up about that. I grew up in a very affluent town. He told me it was the kind of place where it was easy not to have contact with police. The few interactions I had were very respectful and innocuous. A tap on the shoulder, a suggestion to go home. Not everyone is afforded that same presumption of innocence. For some, in particular, Native, Black, and Brown folks in America, mere existence is seen as always already criminal. And it's not just about our legal system I'm talking about, right? It's not just about law enforcement. This is far more pervasive than that. Consider those too who were followed and accused, abused, and viewed as a threat to the neighborhood because of a hoodie, a criminal nuisance because of a barbecue, birthday party, or bird watching, considered a loiterer while taking a nap in their dorm's common room, or a burglar when visiting a friend, or simply trying to come home. People chewed up and spat out as if they weren't somebody's child. Sibling, parent, cousin, friend, mentor, leader, believer, somebody. The criminal legal system is a reflection of our society's values, who we value, who we fear, but also who and what we protect. If the criminal legal system were designed by people that thought that they might one day be involved, or I would add, by people who have been involved, then we would have justice. So I ask you, what's your story? What would your chalkboard say? What would life be like for you if a Google search didn't pull up your carefully curated social media pages, but instead pulled up your mugshot, your rap sheet? What would life be like for you if you had to check yes? We Are All Criminals seeks to close that empathy and that opportunity chasm. Now, here's the good news. Change is happening across the nation. People are recognizing that this is not sustainable in fiscal or in human terms. But just as 1 or 3 or 8 policies and practices didn't get us into the mess that we're in, 1 or 3 or 8 policy changes alone isn't going to get us out of this. So this is my ask of you today. Number 1, stay horrified. Get resensitized. Don't take our mass criminalization, mass disaster as a given. Number 2, stay hopeful. There's a groundswell of change happening across the nation, and we have, the last time I checked, nearly 200 people on the call. You are a necessary and vital part of that change. Thank you for being here. Number 3, see people. Mass incarceration is dependent upon the ignoring and the erasure of the human beings we cage. You can listen to those stories. You can see people in prison, in jail, in the system with criminal records as brothers and sisters, as friends and neighbors, as truly beloved people trying to come home. Which leads us ever so briefly into the last project that we've been working on with We Are All Criminals called Scene. Scene is a prison and poetry project through photography, video, and the written word. And in collaboration with the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop and the brilliant poets inside Minnesota State prisons, we work together to make the invisible visible, the unheard heard, and the unseen seen. So closing us out, in this part of my presentation, stay tuned for the panel, is Bino.
Fire in the hole. Mirror gazing, reflective scab of a man. Cliff diving, Tweety bird burying, 2-bit rascal. Pack mentality, tree climbing, scoundrel in a brothel. King of the mountain, fountain of the youth search, and parable of a person. Who are you to be critical of our mental hospital when we created it? Come on, reach into this hole. Save me from your G.I. Joe's hostile takeover of Barbie and Ken's dollhouse, from being a snake oil peddling door salesman with nothing to offer, 4 jokers in a deck of cards, conniving con man, from that strychnine snorting, whip cracking, world crushing, hush money pushing, prostitute wrangling, nightmare monster creeping orange face. Save me, back flipping domestic terrorist, soon to be dinosaur in the Apple store, you high speed driving bad babysitter with a fifth of liquor, risk taking conservative anomaly of a role model, 2-gun toting deep thinker. Reach into this hole and try and pull me out. Save me from flesh cracking miniature warheads, from the savory taste of illegal success in the phrase he's better off dead, from the rain-filled days, racism maze, from the downswing of a cynic's verbal sickle and being euthanized with euphemisms. Save me like you save fine memories, you mirror gazing conceited, vanity indulged, mohawk wearing duplicitous thing. Unlearn my skewed facts and what I think a breaking point is. Uncapture my mind from the fake sound of freedom ringing. Unravel my thread from the line of our misguided free will. Save me, death-defying couch potato, flapping fish in a frying pan, you ice cube in Arizona heat with the hope of a burning phoenix, evaporate into nothing, heartbeat of a tortoise, pace of a sloth. You're not ready to save me from the fate of an empty funeral and a dry eulogy. You unreligious man of the cloth, street priest with a faulty flock, Bible reading heathen, calorie counting glutton, sin committing hog in a trough, street heretic. Reach into this hole and try and pull me out from being a love paraplegic, from being emotionally crippled, from being a bastard child of distorted lust, from biological clicks ticking in reverse and Hallmark card confessions. Save me. Wanna be Casanova, wanna be outlaw, wanna be musician. You reflecting miscreant in a mirror, gremlin with a grenade, living in harmonious madness like Tupac and Sebastian Bach riding in a Maybach. Save me from a dream deferred in the hues of discrimination and the labels of the nation of incarceration. I'm not your inmate, I'm not your offender, I'm not your client, I'm not your patient, I'm not your reflection, I am your reflection. Now reach into this hole, come on, save me from dilapidated houses, crumbled relationships, smiles filled with potholes, darkened streets of disappearing adolescence, from ignorance is bliss, in the voice of my head, from my ego's power trip. Save me, I dare you, wrench down into this hole and try and pull me out.
I'm not your reflection, I am your reflection. Thank you for that, Bino. And thank you to everybody. All right. Oh, good God, I thought I lost the Zoom. I'm still here, right? People can see me and hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I was closing out of my PowerPoint and I thought I closed out of the presentation. Gosh, I'm sweating over here. All right. Now, allow me to ever so elegantly introduce our panel. Nadine Graves. There she is. Hello, Nadine.
Hi, everyone. I am.
Nadine is the Deputy Director of Community Legal Services at the Legal Rights Center, where she oversees the Criminal Defense Unit. Nadine has a long history of working with, advocating for, and empowering individuals who have been marginalized. Nadine is a former public defender and has represented parents in child protection matters and tenants in housing court. She is currently the host and producer of The Waiting Room with Nadine Graves. It's a podcast. I highly encourage you to listen in and subscribe. It is beautiful. Where she provides a mic for the unheard, exposing the invisible impact upon families affected by the criminal legal system. Thank you for being here, Nadine.
Thank you for having me.
Next up is Father Dan Griffith. He joined the University of St. Thomas School of Law faculty in 2011 and currently serves as the Wenger Family Faculty Fellow of Law. He is the founding director of the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing, which seeks to respond to harm that occurs from leadership and institutional failures, racial injustice, and polarization in a way that promotes accountability and healing. His work in restorative justice has taken him beyond the Twin Cities, where he regularly speaks and facilitates programming. Thanks for being with us here, Father Dan. Fong Lee, there he is, in his argyle sweater, looking very nice, Fong, is an artist and storyteller based in St. Paul. Fong spent nearly 18 years inside Minnesota State Prison. He's a dedicated restorative justice practitioner, a fellow with We Are All Criminals, a published writer, and a photographer. He is a community partnership coordinator for the Legal Revolution. Fong and his family immigrated to the United States as Hmong refugees when Fong was a child, after his family was displaced from their borrowed home in Laos. Fong, I am always happy to see you on a call. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And next up is Sir Richard. Richard McLemore, hey Rich, is the executive director at One Day at a Time, an organization that believes knowledge is critically necessary to ending homelessness. I think we can all agree with that. One Day at a Time's foundation is holistic housing education, and through education, One Day at a Time demystifies the path to stable housing. Rich also trains fellow mental health practitioners at various correctional institutions throughout the nation, facilitating balanced and equitable approaches to their service. So now I'm going to.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, Rich. All right. First of all, each of you brings a particular lens to how we think about criminal records, perceptions of criminality, and the impacts on housing. To start, could each of you kindly share a little more about yourself and why you're here? Why is this conversation important to you? Rich, I'm going to start with you.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. And thank you once again for having me today. This conversation is important to me for a couple of different reasons. Most notably, as I am the executive director of One Day at a Time, and Emily said, we are a housing stabilization organization, but that can mean a lot of different things, right? And our foundation is education. We believe that the way for a family to find sustainable, meaning keeping their housing, is to put the family at the head of the household, right? And the only way to do that is to help them make informed decisions through having proper information. So it's important for us to really work on this project because we want to see more equity built into housing, right? Just through our educational services is a foundational goal. Secondly, I'm a justice impacted individual myself with almost 2 decades of incarceration. I intimately understand what it's like to get out to a society that I don't understand and be told one thing while I'm incarcerated, but then navigate it out to the population really in a way that I wasn't prepared for, which meant I slept on a garage floor when I was first released. And then my first apartment ended up being about $1,500 a month for a studio in 2013. So just from the very beginning, I made some critical errors in my housing, but I didn't know, right? So this conversation is duly important for me because as an educator that found out and as an individual has been like victimized by this process, I just want to see some equity built in because I'm not trying to dismiss the charge. I'm not trying to dismiss what I did. But now that I'm out of society, I feel like I should have a fair shot, right, and ability to provide if I'm out here. And I can't do that without stable, long-term housing. So thank you.
I think that's so important to note that Rich is not only educating, but directly responding to miseducation that he knows occurs inside and out. Thank you, Rich, for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us today. Nadine, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank
Tell
you.
us a little bit about you and why you're here.
Yeah, about me, as you stated, I'm the Deputy Director at the Legal Rights Center. I oversee our criminal defense unit. We are a public defender corporation, so we represent, as you described it, people who are who live in inconceivable amounts of poverty. And prior to this, I was a public defender. I've also been a court-appointed attorney representing parents in child protection matters, and also people facing eviction. This conversation is important to me because oftentimes as a PD, during bail arguments, I would often argue for reasons for why people need to get out of jail. And oftentimes it was, I need to get back to my housing. I'm at risk of losing my housing. And often that fell on deaf ears. People would be held in for $78 or very low amounts in order to ensure that they'd come back. But what those judges were doing were ensuring that people were losing their housing. They were ensuring that people stayed in this vicious cycle. And so this conversation is important, and because I'm hoping that individuals on the bench, I'm here hoping that others who are opposing counsel hear this conversation and get another perspective and vantage point of how our criminal legal system impacts people outside of the courtroom.
Thank you so much for that, Nadine. I love Nadine for many reasons, her tenacity, her heart, her brilliance, but also because she is a storyteller and a story holder. She gathers these stories in her representation as well as through her podcast. So please, for those of you who have not been directly impacted, to listen to other people who have been through the system and to learn more about their struggles and how you may be able to help, tune into the waiting room. Father Dan, I'm passing this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for moderating the panel. Thanks to all my fellow panelists. Really honored to be with them and with all of you for this conversation. And I thank Catholic Charities for being the convener today. I think back to a couple of experiences that have shaped me in terms of my understanding, which is growing, but also advocacy and really seeking to shed light on reality and the harm of reality. And I think back when I was a young priest, I actually had a little time to do pro bono work. And I remember representing a young woman, a mother, in a case of property crime for which she had been charged. And she had said she was innocent, and I represented her. And the key, because she knew what was at stake, was to not have a felony, because she knew that it would impact her life as a mother, her employment, and then her housing. She knew that. And so I was heartened that the prosecutor and the judge allowed there to be a particular resolution of the case, but she might have had opportunities that others, as you noted, Emily, at the beginning, would not have had. And the cascading effect of those who have been charged and convicted of crime. The other way I come at this is as a law professor. We look at the American system, the criminal legal system and policy through the prism of Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching, which is part of the foundation of Catholic Charities, is trying to promote a more just and humane social order. As Emily noted in her her excellent introduction, we are an outlier here in the United States in so many ways, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So when you look at those who are coming back and seeking stable housing, there are so many things that we throw at people that are horrible for them. They inhibit the common good, and they make no sense. They continue to have us in the place of the outlier that we are, and it's up to us to change the system. And this conversation is part of that. And then finally, I would say I'm newly the pastor of the Basilica of St. Mary, and if I had my window, my shades open here at the law school, I could see the dome of the Basilica. There are wonderful programs and accompaniment of those who struggle with housing stability and homelessness there at the parish. And we have folks constantly who are our brothers and sisters as part of our parish, as part of our community. And so that has been a real gift in these last 9 months. And it inspires me all the more to really work with our brothers and sisters and all of you for a Minnesota and a society that's more just and humane. Great to be with all of you.
Thank you for that, Father Dan, and thank you for underscoring the need for all of us on the call, the obligation to affect change. I appreciate that. And last but never least, dear Fong, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here on the call.
So I'm Fong. As you mentioned, Emily, I was just impacted. I spent nearly 18 years in prison. I just got home 9 months ago. Gonna be 10 months in a couple of weeks, and I'm here because throughout the whole time I've been home, 9 months, 10 months, I've been struggling to find housing, and I faced all the barriers and all the nonsense that they throw at me because of who I was, not because of who I am or because of who I will be, but because of who I was at 17 years old, 18 years old, and that barrier right there is very difficult. It's a very difficult hurdle to get over just to find housing, and the lack of I feel like the lack of stable housing often led to guys going back in there. So I'm here to just listen and talk, share my experience with everyone in this meeting. So thanks for having me.
Always happy to share space with you, Fong. Thank you for sharing a bit of yourself with us today. All right, everyone, I'm turning this again over to you. How do you view the term restorative justice? It's come up a few times in our conversation already today. How do you view RJ as not just an idea, but as a living practice? Fong, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. So when I think about restorative justice, right? So just to make it, easy for this in this content, in this space that we have right here, I often thought about it's not about reacting, but it's about responding. Because when we react to folks that coming home, in terms of finding housing, we just gonna react to who they were again at 17, 18 years old, 16. And when we talk about the brain development, right, that's like you're still stuck in the past as well. That's why you're reacting to the past. You're not mature yet to where you're responding to these folks that are coming home, try to provide them with, better housing or stable housing in order for them to, be better themselves and pass that on too. So when I thought about restorative justice, it's not about forgiveness. It's about healing. It's about humanity. It's about listening. It's about understanding. It's about, responding to crisis, responding to the person in front of you that needed help. So that's me. And I'm sure I could sit here and talk all day about restorative justice because I practice restorative justice, but I got some excellent, brilliant mind on the panel, so I'm gonna let them share too.
Fong definitely does live, he embodies restorative justice. And thank you so much for that very I think, distilled way of looking at it. Is this a response or a reaction, right? Are you being responsive or reactionary? I hadn't thought about it in those terms, and I really appreciate that. Father Dan, I'm passing it to you.
Great. Thank you to Emily, and thanks to Fong. Really well said. There may be a number of folks on the call who may not know much about restorative justice. They might have heard just a little bit. 7 years ago, I was in that camp, and I was a skeptic. So I heard about it, and I remember my initial reaction being one of skepticism. But this sounds fuzzy and ethereal, new age. What I found is I've moved from skeptic to practitioner now. It's been a great gift as a minister, as a lawyer, a professor, because restorative justice works. It began really as a gift of the culture of indigenous First Nation peoples in North America and New Zealand. It's now become a worldwide movement because it's effective, it's adaptable across multiple circumstances and professions, and it's also inclusive of multiple parties and stakeholders. So I've seen it time and time again in complex situations. I've seen it with law students sometimes talking about harm they've experienced for the first time in their lives. Nadine and Emily and I, vulnerability might not have been part of our law school training, but I see it now holding a real potential for young lawyers to really question the outcomes, which we're going to talk about in a minute, of our current criminal legal system in a way that's more just and humane, responding to harm, but as Emily said in her introduction, in a way that doesn't go around accountability, but really fosters accountability so that people can hear about the nature of harm, but also share their own stories. It's about sharing our stories and fostering our common humanity, as Fong said, and our common dignity. And it's so aligned with the conversation we're having today. It is about restoration, allowing people, and housing is so close to our human dignity and a life of flourishing. So thank you for asking about restorative justice. It's become a passion and I think is a light for a better future.
Thank you for that, Dan. And I think that for all of the members of bench and bar who are on the call today, I think we can all agree that we would have benefited greatly in our legal education had we had Father Dan as a professor, if we had had the conversation about restorative justice before we were given such extraordinary power in the world with our legal degrees. With that, Nadine, you want to weigh in?
Thank you. I echo both what Father Dan and Fong have so eloquently stated. For me, restorative justice is a means to build relationships and repair harm. Our criminal legal system is adversarial. When you walk into a courtroom, you have a judge that's perched up looking down at you. You have opposing counsel, defense counsel sitting across, separate from each other. You have, if you're in a trial, the jurors are looking at you, and no one is sitting in a circle, how I've seen restorative justice happen, and everybody has to be quiet and have to listen to what everyone says, and everyone has an opportunity to talk and share in this context how they've been harmed, what led to that harm. And so there's an understanding, because how our current legal system is set up, there's no true opportunity for you to hear about that. Perhaps when a defense attorney or defendant is trying for some mitigation and to explain their life circumstances, you might hear it. In a victim impact statement, you might hear it. But other than that, there's no true space that as we currently operate, that allows for that restoration, allows for that healing, allows for true accountability. And so when I think of restorative justice, I see a practice that, as Father Dan says, it's tested, it's proven, it's long-term. Indigenous people have been using these practices to solve their problems without the criminal legal system as we have it now. And so I think of the restorative justice as, yes, building relationships, repairing harm, and just some sense of hope in humanity for us to get past the harms and the traumas that we all live with in this world.
Thank you for that, Nadine. I'm reminded when I was working in North Carolina with folks who are on death row, someone once told me that the people with the most to say in the courtroom are the ones who say the least, the ones who are not allowed to speak, right? So the people who have been harmed, the people who are accused of affecting that harm, they're silenced. And how can we ever expect there to be any opportunity to heal when that is the case? Rich, you want to close us out with your thoughts on restorative justice? Close out from this question. I keep thinking that people are going to log off. Don't log off yet.
Jump off. I'll jump off.
Yeah. Rich, you want to answer this question? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yes. Definitely. Thank you. Echoing what everyone said, when I think about restorative justice, it reminds me of a saying that I heard growing up. And I used to hear, if you're not at the table, you're on the table, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the table. So for me, restorative justice, restorative practice is about having everybody at the table, right? Having, all those players that everyone has talked about at that table with an equal voice, right? Because there's some tables that people sit at, and just like him said, they're not empowered to speak. They don't have the ability to speak up for themselves. And that is for the folks that have been affected and those who have affected others, right? So for me, restorative justice is really weaving into not only the work I do, but how I feel about this life moving forward, because I have impacted people, right? And I've had to sit at those tables, and I've wanted to sit at those tables. And that's why I go back and I love to do this work because, like Father Dan said, it works. It's effective. If you don't get to the root cause, which is the pain, it's going to recreate, it's going to fester, and it's going to happen again, right? Right after the anger, right after everything's resolved, if you don't get to the pain, it's going to happen again. And that's what I feel restorative practices do. They get to the root of it, which is the pain, so people can begin to heal, but not only heal individually, but heal together. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rich. And I know that in that context, you're talking about those conversations, that healing, that accountability, and that welcome back into the fold, not just within the legal system, but within housing disputes too. I know that you've talked about the importance of just conversation with people who are in housing. So thank you so much for that. And Rich, I'm going to stay with you and add Fong. What are some of the biggest barriers that our homecomers face along the road to housing stability, or stability in general? Rich, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Fong, I'm going to start us off. All right. For me, it's an understanding that, and this, please don't, it gets a little technical, but it's an understanding that a capitalistic society, the society that we all live in right here, is only going to make so many concessions, right? As an executive director of a nonprofit, I get to see the grants and what grantors and foundations and these organizations with authority, financial authority, are funding, right? And there's this term going around right now called low barrier programming, right? And I understand it in a philosophy, but I know that term was coined by someone who hasn't been incarcerated, who hasn't been or impacted by multiple barriers, because if they understood and they had multiple barriers that they had overcome, they would know that there's no such thing as low barriers, because everybody suffers from something. Just as impacted folks suffer from a little bit more, right? So, in talking about, right, the intersection of housing and criminality, we can't enable folks that are coming out of incarceration to believe that there's going to be systems in place to supplement and supply them for life. We have to give them a foundation. That's why they need to be at the table, so eventually they can sit at the head of their own table, or they'll be back at our table every 3 to 6 months requesting, looking for, needing further assistance. So for me, that intersection, once again, is foundational skills in housing, education, informing folks that they can make an informed decision. Because if you don't allow them to make a decision for themselves, and you're okay with making a decision for them, what is that going to do for the family? How is that sustainability? How is that some form of independence? How is that good service provision, right? How is that being neighborly? So for me, it's important that folks understand that it's okay to make some concessions. But we have to understand the reality is that the finite resource and money is not going to continue to supplement things. So we have to start putting the families first. Families first. And with that, I'm going to pass.
Thank you for that, Rich. Fong?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree with everything Rich said. I just want to add a little bit. Some of the biggest barriers I'm facing right now as a recently, released individual, is my ability to talk to the landlord or the property manager, right? Or my inability to have them listen to me. That's one of the biggest barrier, right? Like everything else Rich talk about comes in play too. But my thing is, if I'm sitting here, try to be transparent with you, and you're not gonna give me the time of day to listen to me, to tell you the story of where I'm at, and you're just gonna automatically say, turn a blind eye or turn a deaf ear simply because of the very mention, at the very mention of, oh, I am just impacted. You turn me away right away. You won't even take the time of day to listen to me, right? In addition to that, I thought to myself, what about guys who are coming home that don't know how to articulate themselves, that don't know how to be transparent with the landlord or the property manager, right? There's no chance there as well. Their chance is even lower, I like to think. Me and Rich went out house shopping, apartment shopping for myself one time. And I told Rich, I said, look, my first time, you're going to have to do all the talking so I could learn from you, right? Now, granted, I have people like Rich in my life. I have, good support system. I have good family that, let me sleep in their house here and there, if not for as long as I want, But it's one of the things where, again, it's about humanity, right? Just give that person your ear. That's all he asked or she asked. Whatever else happened. But that's one of the biggest barriers I'm facing right now is just getting people to listen. So that I passed.
Thank you, Fong. And thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your story with us. And thank you to the people on the call who are listening, right? This is a kind of through line through all of this, that importance, the importance of listening and seeing and acknowledging humanity. Thank you, Fong. Father Dan, I'm going to turn to you. From a legal systems perspective, where have you seen us as a community fall short in the way that we approach crime, how we use or fail to use restorative justice, and how we think about reintegration? All apologies for the compound question.
Great. Thanks, Emily. I think that when I look at our current culture in the United States and Minnesota, I think we have to examine our culture honestly and with an eye toward what we might say as Americans is fostering a more perfect union. I think when it comes to our criminal legal system, we have a huge gap between what we hopefully desire collectively for human flourishing and justice for all, and what we currently have. And I think we also have to zero in on our Minnesota culture, I think in a way that is wide-eyed and honest. And we have to confront and name the harm of some of the most significant disparities when it comes to race in the United States. And we have to ask the question, what in our Minnesota soil is part of what continues to perpetuate those injustices? And those are hard conversations, but they're necessary conversations. There's a reason why George Floyd was murdered here in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. We have to acknowledge that. And I think the criminal legal system so often manifests what I think in American culture is a very much has a punitive dimension, a harsh dimension toward justice, one that lacks mercy, that seeks to take the human person and their stories and their past trauma, which we know that there's a significant correlation between past trauma and folks who get caught up in the criminal legal system, in a way that is more humane and that really fosters the common good for everybody. And that's such an important connection to the housing question as well. And I think restorative justice has a role to play. I'll tell a quick story about John Choi, the county attorney in Ramsey. So in 2015, Ramsey County charged the archdiocese with criminal counts and a civil case in terms of its failure to protect children in the Twin Cities community. Choi, I think, in a very creative way, included two restorative justice provisions that were in the ultimate settlement agreement. I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have an initiative on restorative justice and healing at St. Thomas. I wouldn't be doing this work had he not been creative. And I think the challenge for lawyers, particularly those who are in the criminal legal system, is we can be groove runners, whether it's judges or prosecutors. I think public defenders like Nadine, who's had that in her past service, tend to be more open to restorative justice because I think they're proximate to their clients and see the work that's been done. But one of the things that John Choi talks about is we're not delivering good outcomes through our criminal legal system. We're just not. The data's there. To continue to run in those same grooves when we have the disparate and disproportionate effects on people of color and not fostering good outcomes is madness. So we've got to look at American culture, Minnesota culture, the criminal legal culture, and the culture of law, and ask tough questions and advocate for change. And restorative justice, I think, has a really powerful potential to play an important role in crafting a better future.
I'm going to stay with you for just a second, Dan. I want to know what the conversations about that Minnesota soil, good Lord, Minnesota soil, that's really coming out. What those conversations have been like with your students, and if you did you try to have those conversations outside of an RJ lens first, and how things have changed?
Yeah, good question, Emily. My really process of being educated on reality, including reality here in Minnesota, began in my own law school with close friends of mine, African-American law students who were experiencing daily harm because of the color of their skin. And so it's also my education has been fostered through teaching and hearing from Black law students and their experiences, and really having the courage to so beautifully and prophetically share their experiences in law school settings. And that has opened the eyes. And that is a form of, that's restoration. If we actually move, my colleague, Amy Leibod at St. Thomas says, restorative justice is great, but it's meant to lead to transformative justice. The power of story and naming harm should lead to transforming unjust structures, including in the criminal legal system. So organically, Emily, it's happened through people just sharing their stories. Me being open from 1994 to 94 to 97 at Mitchell with William Mitchell to the experiences of my classmates and knowing how much I didn't know, and through my own lens of privilege and things having advantages that other folks don't, which in itself is unjust. So in any event, it's been a long process, but again, it's the power of story and reality that can be not only restorative but transformative, hopefully.
I appreciate that. Also, shout out to Amy. She's amazing. And again, underscoring the importance of story and listening. My dear Nadine, I'm passing it to you now from a legal perspective, as well as a personal one. How do you see our perceptions of crime or criminality impacting access to housing?
Unfortunately, due to our legacy of slavery, white supremacy, racism, and so forth, most Black and Brown people already have this presumption of suspicion and criminality, and therefore ultimately guilty. And so if you add on the layer of a criminal record, it only exacerbates the stigma and makes life a lot harder. I hear Fong explaining about how hard it is for him to articulate to a potential landlord why he should rent to him. But in before even getting to that point, he has to write down rental history. What does he put down? Does he put DOC down? There's shame that may be attached to that. If there's a credit check, what employment has he had? Does he put MNCOR down? You know, these are the real life things that folks have to grapple with when they're trying to get housing. And if, you know, a prospective landlord is not versed on, you know, MNCOR to know that, hey, this has been employment history, or this person, just that record that they've been doing good while they've been incarcerated, that they don't have that vantage or that access to that perspective, they're just going to shut him out and not give him any opportunity. Fong mentions that he has loved ones that he could live with, and not everybody has that. Some people's family members and loved ones shut them out when they're incarcerated, and so they don't have that access. So they're left to resort to back to whatever community that they had. And so unfortunately, our legal system, in my opinion, perpetuates the very driving forces of crime, of poverty, of inequity. All of these things drive violence. And so in a sense, we are crippling people from being able to have the lives that we say we want people to have, and essentially ensuring that they will enter back into the system. And so that cycle continues to go on. So for folks to say, you know, the system is broken, in my opinion, it's not broken, it's working well. And, you know, fortunately, we have individuals like Fong and Rich who have had a good community and resources around them to show that there's another way, but everybody needs to have access to the same things that Rich, Fong, and people like myself have had. You asked about a personal perspective of this. I had a loved one who had an extensive criminal history. We moved into an apartment, and because of his criminal history, we didn't put him down on there. No issues, rent paid on time, everything going great. Well, he got arrested. Part of getting arrested on something that had nothing really to do with him, but that's how it triggered where he was living. Once our landlord found out, we had to move out immediately. Not that there was an issue with our being tenants there, not that we weren't paying, that there was no issues, but because now that this person has a criminal record and maybe deemed, you know, the perception of what that criminal record was, we had to move. Now we're moving into conditions I wouldn't want my worst enemy to live in. And, you know, and that caused irreparable harm in my relationship. And so these things, you know, the criminal legal system, our records, not only impact the individual who's trying to go on with their life, but it also impacts the family members who have to pay for that, you know, because of this person's mistakes or their past indiscretions. We all struggle with shame. There's tensions that can grow in the home. People feel abandoned. And the records just continue to impact people for well past the time that they've served. And so, yeah, our system needs to do something better to be able to address these harms. We have folks that are literally living in the shadows of wealth. You come downtown and you see these tall skyscrapers that embody wealth, and yet people are living in tents near bridges right near there. I had a client once that was being charged for public intoxication. And while at court, he asked, why should I be charged with public intoxication where on the same corner where I was standing drinking, there were people sitting outside of these restaurants that had patios? So isn't that public intoxication? But why is it lawful for him to do it? Because he's a part of this business that's generating income, and I'm not generating income for this business. And so we have to just question, why some things are considered a crime. Why is it a crime for one person, but not a crime for another person to do the similar conduct?
Nadine, I'm going to stay with you for just a second. I know you were representing folks in housing court for some time. Can you give the folks on the call who have not been through housing court, who have not witnessed that, kind of an insider's perspective? Is there an opportunity to bring RJ into the conversation? Do you see any potential systemic changes to housing court that may be on the horizon?
I do think there's always an opportunity for RJ to come in because, like I said, I think it's about relationship building. People come into housing court. When I was doing it was fresh out of the pandemic. So that's a whole nother can of worms where people their jobs have been impacted. And so their ability to pay had been eliminated. And so landlords had to bring people in after the referendum was raised so that they can try to figure out how to get compensated. In those instances, there's organizations, which I'm sure Rich could speak to, that were able to help pay rent and back pay rent. There were individuals who, like how I just described, had criminal records and weren't forthcoming with their criminal record, and somehow it came to the landlord's knowledge, and now this person has to go. There were individuals who, have paid insane amounts of down payment down payment and rent and all of these things and fall behind, and automatically they're put out because of the pandemic. And so I do think conversations, a circle, resources that can help people get on their feet would be helpful. There's people that are struggling with mental health. There are families that have brought on loved ones to live with them, and because of some sort of issue, because we haven't addressed other causes that brought this person into the system, it just creates the shame and problems in the household that brought them into housing court. And so I think if the solutions to this is multifaceted, but starting with a dialogue, starting with that conversation, to be able to address or to even get an understanding of what's going on in people's lives, I think people would be, a little more understanding if they can be when it comes to the housing matters.
Thank you for that, Nadine. And that brings us to our last question, which was going to be about how people on the call can get involved. And I hear that was actually the first question that appeared in our Q&A. So I'm going to pass it over to Mike. And Mike, do you want to read from the Q&A?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. We're going to spend the last little time that we have here today to take some questions from folks. So you can, we have a few written down, and if you'd like to ask it with your voice in person, if you will, you can raise your hand. But just to capture the most number of people who are on the call right now, I want to start with what can feel like a closing question. And someone asked in the Q&A how they can get a JD, so someone who has practiced, how they can get involved. What can they do with your organizations, or how can they help? So can you speak to the people on this call? What can folks do to help untangle these systems of incarceration and housing justice, whether that be with your organization or just generally speaking, one invitation for them? I'm going to start with Rich.
Man, Mike, thank you. I know you must have saw me getting fidgety, right? Right. So super low hanging fruit that everyone can do, right? Because like you said, this is a JD asking this question. So a highly educated person, and I'm assuming that most folks on this call have some form of knowledge or some form of passion about this topic, right? And you're probably taxpayers as well. So talk to your local representative about one thing. And that one thing is making sure that all landlords, and I mean all landlords with the exception of none, all landlords put the rental criteria on their website. That's it. That's it. There needs to be some type of law that can be passed that makes it mandatory for landlords and house providers to put their rental criteria on their website. Because if you see right now, a lot of landlords don't do it, right? And then it causes folks to have to apply for a place 5 and 10 times. And some folks may not know, but that's $40 to $50 per time. That's some people's car payment. That's some people's food for the month. That's some people's transportation costs to get to and from work so they can make some more funds, right? To spend some more money on application fees, right? So yes, just putting your rental criteria on the website is super low hanging, super easy. It takes one quick email to your representative saying, this is what we want. And that's what I would like the folks to leave with, if nothing else from my perspective.
Awesome. Thank you. Father Dan, do you have an invitation for folks?
Yeah, number of things. What I would say is volunteer at particular organizations that are either promoting reentry or listening. We do this at Basilica every week, so there's opportunities to volunteer at the Basilica of St. Mary. Become informed. I think programs like today's are really helpful. Not only are they helpful in terms of information, but they're inspiring because you see that folks have hung on the call. And so there's a sense of, I take from this a sense of inspiration to continue to have conversations like this and do this work. Either promote when laws come up in the Minnesota legislature, the transformation of law in this particular space to make it more easy for folks, our homecoming brothers and sisters, to find a place consistent with their human dignity and flourishing. We can transform law and policy to make it more aligned with justice and humanity. And I would say learn more about the role of restorative justice. Similarly, if restorative justice legislation comes up, I know Sandra Feist and others have been in the Minnesota House have been promoting this for youth, and all the other ways. We now have a veterans court model which responds to the reality of harm that our brothers and sisters who have served have experienced and how that leads into the criminal legal system. But let's really proliferate those opportunities on the restorative justice side. My colleague Julie Craven and I would come to your law firm, come to your organization and do a little primer on what restorative justice is, how it can be used in the profession of law and the legal system, both on the criminal side, but also the civil side. We just were at a law firm in Bloomington earlier this month. So we'd love to join you and have that conversation. And then finally, I would say, become proximate to our brothers and sisters who have experienced these hurdles and barriers. Learn from our brothers and sisters. One quick story, I know we're coming up on time, but I was celebrating a funeral at Basilica and all the eyes moved to the left, and it was one of our homeless brothers and sisters who had their sleeping bag and was walking down the side aisle. And I thought, I'm very saddened that they're experiencing this, but also proud of a community that would say, our doors are open to everybody and you're part of our community. And that proximity to folks, all of our brothers and sisters, is really critical for our conversation.
Thank you. It reminds me of one of my favorite phrases: proximity breeds empathy, distance breeds suspicion. And yeah, thank you for that. Fong, an invitation for those listening.
Yeah, I mean, everything Rich and Father Griff has said is very, very dear to my heart. You could take it to the legislation, whatever, but since we're running out of time, I just like to personalize something real quick, right? Is, for whoever's listening, you could take it to your family, take it to your friend, talk to them, right? And stop the perpetuation of the stereotypical perception of those who are impacted by the law that are coming home to us, that we're not responsible, that we are irresponsible, that we're not good, this or that. Okay, just give us a shot. I mean, I'm literally like in here just being vulnerable, right? Like just give us your ear, give us a shot. You know, don't hold us accountable for the rest of our life for what we made, you know, did a mistake or whatever, for the mistake we did when we were 16, 16, 17 years old. You cannot, it's irrational to hold us accountable for the rest of our life for the stuff that we did at a teenage phase. So just talk to your landlord, talk to your local leaders, politician, whatever. Just hey, and for you yourself, just stop perpetuating the perpetuation of a stereotypical perception. Be open-minded, open heart.
Thanks, Fong. Open minds and open hearts. I appreciate that. And Nadine, is there an invitation for folks?
Yeah, I echo everything that's been said already. I saw there was a question asking about how someone can approach this work without causing folks who have experienced harm to experience additional emotional work. I would say to that person or to anyone else who has that similar question, I would say there's spaces where these conversations are already happening. Show up in those spaces and listen. Don't center yourself in that space. Let those who are organizing that work, you listen to what they have to say and how you can support. I also would echo education. There's tons of literature out there about the criminal legal system, restorative justice, abolitionists, like however you want to approach this, there's great material there that you can read. Two books that I would recommend would be Until We Reckon by Danielle Surratt. That book talks highly about restorative justice and answers a lot of the questions where folks come at like, well, what about the murderers? And what about like the most extreme cases you can think about? She comes at it head on about how to address those and has stories after story about how people who have caused very terrible harms have been able to be held accountable and do, I forget how she states it, like do good in the sense of like they make amends for the harm that they've created by being in this restorative practice together. Another book I would recommend is called We Do This Until We Free Us by Miriam Kaba. She brings another vantage point about our criminal legal system from an abolitionist standpoint. And I think that's some people may say it's extreme, but the reality is what we're doing right now is not working. And so we have to be creative. We have to let go of fear. We have to let go of just being shackled to these systems that continue to perpetuate the harms that we say we don't want to have in society anymore. So first, start by educating yourself. Two, get close. I echo proximity with all of the things that have been stated. And if you're a landlord, again, give people an ear, as Fong is saying, like hear people out, give people an opportunity. A lot of the things that prevent people from not living the fullness of their life is not having access and opportunity. And if you are in a position of privilege and power to do so, then you should do so.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a couple more minutes, so I've got two other questions. One that came in, ICWA came about in 1978. Could there be or should there be some kind of response similar for African-American individuals who become involved in the legal system due to generational trauma, brutal racism, etc.? And then because of time, I'm going to bring in the other question that was asked, which was, what is required or is available to folks re-entering in terms of navigation for supportive services or for housing? So what is legally required, or what is what do folks have at their disposal in terms of navigating that? So those are the two that I'll throw out that everybody doesn't have to respond, but if someone has a thought on either of those.
Yeah, I can talk towards the ICWA. ICWA is like the Indian Child Welfare Act, and that comes into play in child protection matters. And so that is a requirement that the government has to give active effort when seeking placement or reunification of a child in a home. And yes, I do think African Americans have a similar history in the United States that should take it should be taken into consideration when they're placing a child or seeking to reunify a child into their parents' care. And so I think active efforts should be given to all people, but if you're not going to give active efforts to everyone, then definitely those who have the historical trauma of what has happened in this country.
Thank you. And perhaps Rich or Fong, are you able to speak to the question around what is at folks' disposal in terms of when they're reentering supportive services that either legally exist, or what is, it may surprise folks to know that there isn't as much as they thought. So any thoughts about that when folks reenter, what services are available to them?
Yeah.
Fong, I can jump in if you want to. Okay. Well, Mike, you're pretty close. There's not many, right? You have some maybe some federal dollars around it that can be used for certain things. Like for instance, if you have maybe a Section 8 voucher and you're coming out and you go through some program where they get you some type of voucher, but Emily talked about certain criminal backgrounds can then eliminate that, right? There's some funding out there they're called HSS. Some of the folks on this call may know what HSS is called, Housing Stability Services, which is some funding passed down, if I'm not mistaken, through Minnesota Housing and Finance, our biggest housing finance agency here in Minnesota, right? But quite honestly, it's only $200 per case for 6 months, and there's no way you can do anything with $200 per household, per case you're helping navigate. Because I just talked about those application fees that are the average of 5 to 10 per household, right? So the math just doesn't add up. So back to Mike, what he said is absolutely true. There's not a lot out there for folks especially when they're released from incarceration in the form of housing navigation, which is incredibly unfortunate.
Everything Rich said, because Rich, has been out here longer, so he know a lot of more resources than I do. Cause I'm still new, fresh, still searching for resources, and apparently not much is out there. So Rich captured it well.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. And then lastly, are they still telling people that they can't be released without a confirmed place to live? Does anybody know the answer to that?
Yeah. Yes, that's my understanding. And sometimes when they get released, then they have to find a job within a certain time period. And if they don't get a job in that time period, they go back.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, so much for your time. I am so grateful. We can give a virtual round of applause to our panel. Emily, thank you so much for having the conversation today. To close us out, I want to introduce Wendy Underwood, who leads the Catholic Charities Social Justice Advocacy and Engagement team, to close us out with a thank you and an invitation. Wendy.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much to Mike Rios-Keating and Emily Baxter. I know you worked really hard with Mike on today's webinar, so thank you so much for your time too. We're so grateful for everyone on the panel and all of our participants today. Hundreds of people registered for this, and which speaks volumes of how much people want to understand and how much there is to learn and to grow. And Mike, you had asked a question about an invitation, and I want to invite people right now to stay connected with Catholic Charities Twin Cities. The easiest way to do that is to scan the QR code right on the screen, and it'll take you to our simple way to stay informed and involved. But I also, just want to just take the moment to say, I invite our participants today to do as many of it as our panelists encouraged us, which is to see people. We say that a lot at Catholic Charities. One of the easiest things you can do is choose to see people, and then see yourself. Pause and reflect on yourself. I also invite you to listen to people. It was noted today that those with the most to say are given the least opportunities. Listen to people, and then listen to yourself. And as Rich was saying, with those given opportunities and not, please, I invite you to invite others to your table. Invite people to your table and choose to learn, ask, and grow, just like we are all doing here together today. And then once again, please follow us at Catholic Charities Twin Cities by scanning that code and finding us on social media. Please join us in our advocacy and in sharing our story. We're so grateful for every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.